Hi and welcome to the second video in this series of organic chemistry where we get to talk about the structural formulae or structural formula as some people may call it. So let's get into what we have for this video and see if we can do justice to a concept or two. So what's structural formula in organic chemistry? Now before we even talk about that, let's make something clear. In organic chemistry, there are different formats and they are called formula in the plural form. And these formula are the formats with which we depict here simply means to show, with which we depict or show compounds. Okay, so let's check out some of them. So when we talk about the formula in organic chemistry, we are simply referring to the styles with which we show organic compounds. And we want to talk about some of those styles, some of those formats, some of those techniques with which we depict organic compounds in organic chemistry. So structure style number one is called the empirical formula. Now the empirical formula simply refers to the simplest whole number ratio of atoms in a compound. For example, glucose, which is a very good example of an organic compound. Okay, glucose has a molecular formula C₆H₁ and O6. Now, if I were to ask you, what is the ratio in which all these elements appear? You can see carbon has 6 atoms, 6 ratio. Hydrogen has 12 atoms ratio, and then oxygen has 6 atoms as well. Now we have 6 ratio 12 ratio 6. But if I'm to break all of this down into its lowest term, I'll end up having 1 ratio 2 ratio 1 because 6 here can be divided by 6, 12 can be divided by 6, and 6 here divided by 6. That's how we end up having 1 ratio 2 ratio 1. Now if I assign all of these numbers to the elements, I would have C, H2 and O. This is the empirical formula of glucose, and that's what we have over here. So the empirical formula simply shows us that the elements appear in a ratio 1 ratio 2 ratio 1. That's the first style or the first format with which we depict organic compounds in organic chemistry. The second style with which we show organic compounds is through the molecular formula. Now, this molecular formula depicts or shows us the actual number of atoms in a molecule. For example, when we mention the chemical compound ethane, which is also an organic compound, we are referring to an organic compound that has 2 carbon atoms and 6 hydrogen atoms. This is the molecular formula. And as you can see, the number of atoms are well depicted and the elements that are present are also depicted as well. So that's another format with which we depict chemical compounds in organic chemistry using the molecular formula. So the first one was the empirical formula. The second one was the molecular formula. The third one is called the structural formula. Now, this is more common in organic chemistry. As we proceed to where we'll be naming organic compounds, you will find them mentioned more often. Now, this formula shows every bond that exists between atoms. So, for example, here is the structural formula for the compound ethane. You can see the structure is highly depicted clearly over here. You can see the carbon atoms 1, 2, and you can see the bonds existing between the carbon atoms. You can see them depicted over here. The bonds are shown. Okay, and you can see that there are hydrogen atoms surrounding every carbon atom depicted in the molecule. The bonds are shown, the hydrogen atoms are shown, and even the carbon atoms are shown. So this is called the structural formula. As we learn how to draw the structural formula for organic compounds, we'll be seeing how these plays out. I just wanted to do a rundown of the different formats with which we depict organic compounds in organic chemistry. So the first is the empirical formula. Let's write that down. The first is the empirical formula. The second is the molecular formula. And the third is the structural. Others like to call it the displayed formula. But whichever you choose to use is absolutely fine. Okay? The displayed formula. And then last of all is called the skeletal or okay, before we get to that, we have another one, the penultimate one. We have the condensed formula. So the condensed formula in organic chemistry is a text-based, okay, text-based. It uses letters. Text-based single line representation of a molecule that does not use bond lines to show how atoms are connected. So for example, we have this over here. Now you can see that there are no bonds that are shown. In the other example that we looked at in the previous slide, we saw carbon and we saw how the bonds were shown between all the hydrogen atoms present. But in this case, all we are having is just text. You can see CH3 showing us that there is one carbon atom over here and three hydrogen atoms over here. And the next thing we have is another CH3 being attached to it. Everything we have here is just in one single line. There are no bond line structures that are being shown. Why? Because this is called the condensed formula. This is another style with which we depict organic compounds in organic chemistry. And then finally, we have the skeletal formula. Now, don't get scared, okay? When we say skeletal formula, we're not referring to this guy over here. I just added this for effect. The skeletal formula is a format with which we depict organic compounds in organic chemistry where the carbon atoms are not written. The hydrogen atoms attached to carbon atoms are not shown either. We use lines to represent bonds, and this is very common in advanced exams. So for example, let's say we were asked to draw the skeletal structure of a compound called butane. We're going to be learning how to name organic compounds, okay? So don't get scared by this name that I just mentioned. If we were to draw the skeletal structure for this guy that I just mentioned, this is what it would look like. You can see I just used bond lines to show everything. Okay, so this is what it would look like. To a layman, it would just be thinking, what are these lines doing on the board? No, but this is actually a system for depicting organic compounds. It is called the skeletal or structural formula. The skeletal structural formula. Okay, that's another way through which we can depict organic compounds. Now that we have said all of that, we'll be moving on to the next thing that we're dealing with in the concept of organic chemistry, which is the homologous series. Okay, I'm so glad you stayed till the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Do well to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.